Podstarz team podcast fans and Podstarz alumni and Podstarz family. My guest today is a gentleman who has written many books. He is an award-winning author who grew up in the Ozarks. So when you watch the TV show on Netflix, maybe our guest might have some input on that general area. Who knows? It's a beautiful part of the world that now I plan on going to thanks to that show. He's also a constant guest. He's a speaker on podcasts and public events and professional events and radio talk shows as well. So he knows what he's doing and he's here to promote everything. Ladies and gentlemen, my guest today is Mr. Karlyle Tomms. Sir, how are you? And welcome to the Podstarz website and the Podstarz team podcast.
I'm doing very well, thank you, and thanks for having me on your podcast.
Hey, anytime, sir. So you are one of our celebrity guests. You are an author, and you are a man of God as well. So please let us know tell us about your first book, when you decided to dedicate your life to books on religion, everything that's about you,
Well,
sir.
actually, my books are not really about religion.
Oh, okay.
Um, yeah, the one book, The Calling Dream, has an underlying religious theme, but actually what that book is about is a televangelist who has a problem. And his problem is that he's a sex addict.
Oh,
And while he is presenting himself to the public and hiding this from his family, he is secretly seducing these women and hating himself for it because he's in conflict with his own religious beliefs and his behavior that he doesn't seem to be able to control.
I'm sure that's actually pretty close to what happens in real life. I'm sure that happens all the time.
Yeah, that may happen. I don't know how often it happens, but it certainly does happen. And I think, you know, the idea behind that book kind of one of the things about that book that I do is I describe my mental imagery is the farm that I grew up on a few years earlier. So the book starts and Pastor Dennison is 10 years old in 1945. And he begins to have these dreams that are a combination of sexual content and religious symbolism. And there's a redheaded woman in all these dreams, and she's a recurring theme, and she eventually becomes his nightmare. But the surroundings of that, because he's a kid who grows up in the Ozarks, the son of a backwoods preacher, and he sees these dreams as calling him to preach. And so this becomes his quest, that he's going to become a preacher, and he's so good at it that word gets around, and he is then interviewed for doing radio and television broadcasts out of Nashville. So he becomes, in time, a famous televangelist. But I described the farm that I grew up on as his upbringing, that the surroundings were the same.
Right.
And some very similar things, that I was raised by my grandparents, and we didn't have running water until I was a teenager. We didn't have a phone. And it was that same kind of backwoods atmosphere that I described for the protagonist of that book.
So you just you're basically the way you grew up and just shifted the characters, took yourself out, inserted
Shifted the
this guy.
character,
I
yes.
see. Okay.
Yeah.
And just you never had this red-headed lady coming out of your life,
No,
did you? Okay, all right, just to make sure.
no.
All right. So that was one of your first books, or that was the first book?
That actually was my second book. I had tried to write novels. You know, I began writing when I was like in the sixth grade. And I had tried and tried and tried to write novels. I could accomplish short stories, I could accomplish poetry, and even edited the literary magazine for my college when I was in college. But I couldn't get more than like 3 or 4 chapters into a novel, and I would block. And I have several ideas still for those novels that I tried to write earlier, and I couldn't get there. And then And around 2008, I was joking with a friend about this burned out hippie woman. And that kind of turned into, what would she say if I just sat down at the keyboard and let her speak? And I just basically typed what I heard in my head as Lavella talking.
Okay.
That became my first novel because she wouldn't shut up.
Oh, nice.
And I kept going back to it again and again and again. I reached writer's block at one point and I put it down for about a year. Then I came back to it and she backed up a little bit and finished the novel. And so I discovered that when I write that way, when I write as though I'm dictating information from these characters, it works
Hmm.
and the story completes itself. But when I try to write from first person and have these different characters interacting, I don't seem to be able to accomplish that. So I write from first person,
Makes
and
sense.
each character is different.
Okay. And but so I've never tried to write anything, but I'm curious, when you sit down and you figure out, and okay, how about this? When you know, when you're doing your thing and you realize that you have writer's block, what exactly, how does that feel? And do you have a certain uh something you do every time to get yourself out of that, or do you just take some time off? Like, I have to take 2 weeks off. Like, what is your timeline? What do you do?
I haven't really had writer's block since I started writing from first person.
Okay.
Writer's block, and before I had these ideas, I think they're great ideas for novels, and I couldn't seem to get there. I couldn't seem to get past the writer's block. It's very frustrating.
Right.
But when I write from first person, I tend not to have writer's block. It's almost like I'm channeling. It's almost like the protagonist is telling me what he or her want to say. Um, and I just simply type what they tell me to type. Now, then I go back. It's like I write a chapter. Then I go back after I've written the chapter and go through and look at how this could be worded better, how something might be able to be tweaked here or there, if there are grammatical errors or, that kind of thing.
And what is your writing process? Are you still a pen and paper kind of guy? Are you a computer, or are you spoken into a tape recorder?
Well, thank God for the computer.
Okay.
I'm a pen and paper if I'm going to write poetry, and I will be releasing a poetry book maybe over the next year or two. I will be releasing a poetry book. I'm working on that right now. But I tend to use pen and paper when I write poetry and then convert it over into text. But when I write the novels, I sit down at the keyboard to do that.
Not the old school typewriter. That's what I picture. I picture you in like a dark room in front of a window with a typewriter and the old.
Yeah. And maybe that was one of the things is I don't think I would have been able to write these had it not been for the invention of the internet.
Oh, okay. There you go.
Because I have a library. It's like that first book was Lavella was born in 1948. She grew up in the 1960s. And that's the book I'm about to release. It was originally published in 2014 by Tiger Eye Publishing. It was endorsed by Meredith Sisko. And Meredith wrote a beautiful endorsement of that book. Meredith was known for the music and for her role in Winter's Bone, it won the Sundance Film Festival Grand Jury Prize, was nominated for 4 Academy Awards.
With Jennifer
And so,
Lawrence.
yeah, so even getting her to review that first book was wonderful. And then she just wrote a beautiful review of it. And that's one of the things that gave me the impetus to keep writing, because that first book was that. What I've done is I've changed the name to Sunrise Over the Pumpkin Patch. And I've gone back and I've shortened it a bit. There are things in it that it was just way too long, and there were things that I just didn't deem as necessary for the story. So, and it's still a long book. So I went back and I reviewed it, and I worked on some grammar in it and that kind of thing, and also worked on shortening some of the episodes out of that. There's one, almost half a chapter I cut out. And so that book is about to be re-released. And the publisher and I right now, it's published by Fresh Ink Publishing. And we are in the latter stages of getting everything prepared. The book cover is done. I have one more proof, I think, to go through. Shouldn't be more than one more proof that I would go through, and then we'll be publishing it. They're preparing the trailer for that right now.
Wow, so it's a lot of things, a lot of irons in the oven, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah, irons in the oven.
So it's funny that you bring up poetry. Just 2 days ago, I interviewed a poet who's on the Podstarz website. His name's the King of Poetry, and he was actually the first poet that I'd actually had a conversation with. And I was very curious as to his the way he goes about his procedure because, as I brought up to him, poetry is not really mainstream. Everyone likes poetry. Well, it's not everybody, but a lot of people like poetry and respect poetry, but it's not at the level of, like people go to a poetry reading on a regular basis. So his goal is to bring poetry more into the mainstream. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with America's Got Talent, but a couple of
Mhm.
years ago, there was a poet that was on it, and he either won the show or made it almost to the finals. And that's when I watch it with my family. That was one of the first times that I really started to understand poetry because I'd never really been exposed to it. So when I watched him, and I was like, I get it because he was literally, you could see everything that he was saying meant so much to him, and the way he was translating it to the audience was very beautiful. So I've become an underground fan of poetry. So when you do release that book, I would love to have a gander at it because I do respect the art. And yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing if people like yourself and the King of Poetry can bring poetry more into the mainstream.
This book is going to be, in addition to poetry, it's an autobiographical self-help poetry book, if you can imagine that. So basically, it's my story, and I start with poetry that I wrote about my childhood and my upbringing and growing up in the Ozarks in the 1960s. And I was bullied at school, and I had abuse at home, and I had all of these things to overcome. And then there's basically four sections. The second section is poetry that I actually wrote from my teenage years through about my mid-20s. And then the next section is on love and about relationships. And then the next section is spirituality. And the book is called The Gulls Are Always Laughing. And it's based on when I moved to the coastal bend of Texas, 2015, that I had a really, really difficult move. And one of the things that I had to do because of that very difficult move that I moved here not knowing anybody. I rented an apartment online without seeing it. That apartment turned out to be a dump. And I was starting a new job where I didn't know anybody, and I was extremely stressed. So I went to my happiness toolbox and began doing the things that I'd learned to do. Actually, first learned it from my grandmother when I was a kid. I would go for walks. I just happened to live across the street from the bay. And I would go over there. And one of the things that I noticed is the gulls were laughing. It's like they were always laughing. They were always happy. And I took that to, blow it off. Don't pay attention to the stress. Listen to the gulls. The gulls are laughing. And so the last poem of that book is The Gulls Are Always Laughing. And each poem has an introduction. Some of them are very brief introductions. Some of them are long introductions where I talk about the process of coming to awareness
Okay.
and how that poem relates to that.
So you wrote a book based somewhat on your upbringing, minus the character. Now you're writing poetry along the same lines. Is this very therapeutic for you? Do you find that it's a release from some of the issues that you have to deal with over your lifetime?
Oh yeah, yeah. I highly endorse writing, journal keeping. There have been a lot of studies done on journal keeping and how keeping a journal is helpful for people to process. And I've had that experience where I sat down where I was angry and upset and sat down and started journaling. And then by the time I got to the end of that process, I was having insights and awarenesses that, okay, rethink this. And here's another way of looking at it. And by the time I got that far into the journaling, then I had those awarenesses.
Makes sense. Makes sense. I mean, if anything that helps you kind of deal with your issues, whether it be just by writing it or talking to somebody, I mean, I guess it's kind of the same thing, but the power of the pen must be very therapeutic for you because you can kind of, I guess, look at what you're writing down and understand that you've gotten to a better place and you're past all that stuff. So
Mhm.
great, good
Well,
for you.
and also, my books in some respects are kind of self-help through fiction
Okay.
because, I had a 42-year career as a clinical social worker. And so the books basically take things that people struggle with, issues and difficulties that they struggle with. For instance, in The Calling Dream, Pastor Dennison has a sexual addiction. In Sunrise Over the Pumpkin Patch, Lavella has an extremely controlling mother and an alcoholic father. And then Edge of Smoke is about a child growing up transgender in the 1970s. Her mother is murdered when she's 10 years old and she gets put in foster care and, you know, begins life from that point forward. But she's growing up in the slums and her mother's a heroin addict and her mother is murdered. And it's about her coming to learn how to love herself, learn how to step away from what she learned in the slums
Right.
to, developing self-love
Hmm.
and dealing with PTSD.
So it sounds like this is the second book where you start off maybe in kind of a darker place, and by the end, it sounds like you're bringing the story into the light.
Right.
Oh, okay. So is that a theme towards most of your
That's kind
books?
of a thing.
Okay.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
And I'm working on a fourth novel right now, and that fourth novel is going to address PTSD specifically related to military trauma, not necessarily combat military trauma, but related to military trauma. It also, one of the things that I try to do with my books is to have compassion in them for different people. In The Edge of Smoke, Stephanie, she's biracial, growing up in the slums. And so it is compassion for people of other races. And that's also in Sunrise Over the Pumpkin Patch. Lavella ends up having a biracial child in that book. And the next book will have the protagonist will be involved with someone who is Native American, whose family is Native American and who her grandfather has the Native American spirituality. And I said the internet is that it allows me to research. I can be in the middle of writing a book and look at and it's like, okay, what was the timeline of this? And in that particular day and age, what was going on? For instance, in Sunrise Over the Pumpkin Patch, Lavella has her biracial baby 4 days before Martin Luther King is assassinated. And so there's the impact
Right.
of that on her and her feelings and her perspective from being white and having to confront her own racism when having a child who is biracial. So that's why I say that my fiction is in a lot of ways it's also self-help because
Right.
it's about people learning how to cope with and deal with struggles that so many people encounter in life.
Especially nowadays. I mean, I don't know how much time you spend on social media, but it seems like the world's more divided than it ever has been about pretty much every single issue that possibly could be. I mean, it's just it's a very dark place, especially Twitter. But I mean, you know,
Yeah.
so if your books are meant to help people get over issues, or even just show people that if you do have the issues, you can overcome those. I mean, that's something I think everyone could really use at this time.
Yeah, yeah,
And it's
I
funny that
agree.
you also said you were a social worker for how many years? 18 years? Sorry, how
42 years.
42 years. So
Mhm.
the poet that I interviewed a couple days ago, King of Poetry, also a social worker.
Huh?
So seems to go hand in hand. I don't know. So if you
Well, the thing is that people tend to, it's like you would be amazed how many clients I had over the years who decided they wanted to go into mental health or they wanted to go into social work. Because when people have experienced their own trauma, they have a need to help others. They don't want other people to suffer the way that they've suffered, and you overcome your own trauma and then you help others. Therefore, my comment about that is no one is better prepared to guide you out of hell than someone who has been there.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. I just interviewed a interventionist from A&E's intervention. Same thing. These guys hit rock bottom, did prison time and all that bad stuff. And then when they got clean and sober, the first thing they do is they want to help other people to make sure that, the road they went down isn't followed by everybody else. And I mean,
Right.
it's just another one of those examples of people wanting to help be a better person. So it's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, I agree. And I think we can probably blame algorithms for all of the polarization that is going on in social media these days. I
I
think,
would think that's a big part of it. Yep.
yeah, there's a wonderful documentary on Netflix about that. And I can't remember the name of it right now. Um, but it's about how algorithms in these different social media sites tend to target extremities. That one of the things they point out in that is they set people up to do Facebook pages, and one of them would it would click on liberal posts, and one of them would click on conservative posts.
Hmm.
And what they discovered with these researchers is that they began to get more and more and more extremist kinds of posts that were fed into their page for
Sure.
them to take a look at. And I think that's one of the things that people have to kind of step back and take those things with a grain of salt,
Yeah.
especially in the age of AI,
Yeah.
where, you can make anything up.
Yeah. I think I watched a similar documentary to that, except one was puppies and kittens, and the other person was sports cars. And then they were asked one was asked to put on politics, and the other person was asked to put on heavy death metal. And then to watch how their feeds instantly transformed. And so
Mhm.
it's I'm very cognizant to the fact that Alexa and Siri and all these things are listening to us, and that's why you get like, "Oh, we're out of milk," and then the next thing you know, you turn on your phone and an Instagram ad for milk pops up. So,
Right.
you're right, man. The world of social media, AI, it's a very scary place, and I'm not used to it. I'm 45 years old. I want nothing to do with it, so I don't know about anybody else. So, yeah, it's a
Yeah.
young man's game. So you said you're working on your fourth book.
Yes.
And how long what is the process like for writing a book for you? Is it like, do you have a certain time frame, or is it just what
Generally,
it is?
generally what happens is that I get an idea. I used to make chocolates for Christmas every year, and the first line of Edge of Smoke popped in my head while I was making chocolates. And I immediately stopped, went and sat down at the computer and wrote 3 or 4 paragraphs just to start that because Stephanie started talking to me.
Okay.
And so that just popped into my head and I sat down and did it. And the first line of the next book um, popped in my head. And the first line of that book is, "She was the most beautiful girl I ever met."
Mhm.
And so from there, the book continues, but it starts with seeing this girl who is beautiful, not necessarily physical beautiful, but beautiful. And the protagonist describing that relationship and that experience of having first encountered her.
Makes sense. Makes sense. And that you're so do you have basically a drop dead date for that fourth book? Like, are you looking at 2025, maybe a little later?
Now, I haven't gotten to it yet. I'm currently working on screenwriting.
Oh, okay.
I've written one sitcom pilot that continues to need polish, and I'm in the process of converting Edge of Smoke into a screenplay.
Okay.
I may consider at a later date converting Sunrise Over the Pumpkin Patch into a screenplay as well.
You don't strike me as a sitcom guy.
Um, I do have my funny side.
No, no,
I
not about the funny. It's like I don't. I see. Your vibe gives off maybe not so much like a Friends or like a The Office or that sort of thing. I don't know. Is that what kind of sitcoms do you like?
I like, see what kind of sitcoms. Actually, a lot of the older ones I like. The last one that I really got into was Will and Grace.
Oh, okay. I watched a bit of that
And
back in the day.
yeah, that's been back in the 90s, and I hardly ever watch TV anymore.
Oh, really?
And I don't know, when I watch TV, 9 times out of 10 I'll watch documentaries. But I had the idea for the sitcom, geez, before I moved to Coastal Bend, I had the idea for that, and that was, I moved in 2015, so I had the idea for it back in when I was living back in the Ozarks. I had moved to Nashville and lived in Nashville for 14 years, and then I ended up moving back to the Ozarks. Part of the reason for that was to care for my grandmother, who was aging at that time. She passed in 2002. But I moved back over there. And so I was hesitant to move back into rural area and small town. And was it the same as when I grew up?
Hmm.
And I was pleasantly surprised that I had a wonderful experience moving back there. And so that's kind of the idea of the sitcom is this person who is from the Ozarks, who's now living in Chicago, and he's a doctor, and he ends up losing his job and ends up in bankruptcy and ends
Has
up,
to go back.
yeah, the only job that's available to him. And this kind of happened to me. The only job available to him is at this little hospital in this tiny little town in the Ozarks. And he has to move back home when he has had all of this time away and experienced all of these other things and has become a city boy.
Big city,
But
successful doctor, cars,
right,
boats, and such a nice go back to the Ozarks, crawling back
yeah,
sort of scenario. I get it.
yeah.
Is the Ozarks as beautiful as it was on that show? I mean, I only got glimpses of it, but it looked fantastic.
It's beautiful. Yeah, it begins to flatten toward East Arkansas, begins to flatten into the Mississippi Delta over in East Arkansas, but up around Missouri, they're not huge mountains like the Rockies,
Hmm.
but they're big tree covered mountains all around in that area. The area up around Fayetteville, Eureka Springs, Bentonville, those kinds of places up in there, and Lake Ozark, I think, is where they oriented that show toward, is up near Lake Ozark.
Right.
Beautiful area. Yes, it's a beautiful area.
Any truth to the rumor that the locals of the Ozark are very unhappy with the show because of all the tourism that's now being flooded into that area?
I don't know. I haven't heard that. I haven't heard that. And I think there are probably a lot of folks around there who would invite the tourism because
Means
tourism is
money.
money.
Yeah, yeah. And you brought up Nashville, which is actually on my bucket list of things to do because I've had many friends come to or go to Nashville and say it is insanely amazing. Just
Yeah.
everything about it. I hear it's very expensive, and I hear it's like a small town music city, Vegas, which I've never been to Vegas either, so I won't be able to compare. But
Well, the folks in Nashville call it Nash Vegas.
oh, okay, so that kind of okay makes sense now. Yep, makes sense.
So it doesn't have the gambling, but it's very cosmopolitan. You would not think, from stereotypes, from if you just look at country music, how cosmopolitan it is, but it's very cosmopolitan. And one of my favorite places there was the Centennial Park with the Parthenon, and they have a replica of the Parthenon there. It came from one of the World's Fairs back in, the World's Fair was held in Nashville, and I think in the 1920s or 30s, something like that. And they built a cardboard replica of the Parthenon, and then got funding later and converted it into concrete. And you walk inside the Parthenon, and they have it's like a 2 story tall, 3 story tall, gold plated replica of the goddess Athena.
Oh, sweet.
So you walk in, and it's just, this is what the folks back in ancient Greece walked in on when they went to the Parthenon.
Sweet. Yeah,
Yeah.
Nashville's on the list of things to do. I'm glad the Vegas the gambling thing's in there, because that's the only reason I've never been to Vegas is I'm not a gambler. So I really like.
Well, I'm not either, but I
Yeah.
love Las Vegas.
Oh, okay. The bright lights, the bells, the whistles, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's wonderful just to walk through the casinos, and there's lots of other things to do besides gambling. The
Oh,
first time I was there, I gambled $3 in 3 days.
just to say you did it, I would imagine, because there's really no point.
Yeah, I guess to say I did it.
Yeah, because I know those Vegas shows are insanely expensive. So if you're gonna go, you really got to commit.
Right.
Did you do the Grand Canyon?
Have not done that. I have not done that.
Also
We're
insanely expensive.
considering the possibility of moving to Las Vegas.
Oh, the heat. Oh my.
Yeah, well, it's hot here too, and it's 3 times as humid.
Oh, okay. The humidity is the killer. That's when it really drags you out of it. It just sucks
Yeah.
all the energy out of you, and you just don't want to leave the house. So yeah, we're lucky. We're having some amazing weather here in Toronto, where it's very, very humid. But so if anyone that tells you those rumors about the snow and all we do is play hockey and drink beer, and it's always snowing here, it is not. It is actually very, very nice here. So we're very,
Summers are different.
very lucky to be. Have you ever been to Toronto, Canada?
No, I haven't been to Canada at all, but
Oh, okay.
I do wish to go to Canada. That's one of the things on my bucket list,
Oh yeah. I mean, just
but I won't go in winter.
that I was just gonna say that. Just make sure you pick and choose your times, because if you pick the wrong time in Canada, then you're gonna be like, I knew it. Everything I heard about it was right. This is it. This is all they do. It's all they've got.
Well, I moved down here to get away from Ozarks winters, and so I consider that Canada winters are probably much worse. I
In
therefore
parts.
will only come in the summer.
Yeah, definitely in parts. All right, sir. It's been a fantastic interview. Again, you're available for bookings on the Podstarz website. You have very many different things that you can talk about. What we try and tell our podcasters is you don't have to be strictly podcast on books or authoring or anything like that. Be diverse and interview somebody that you may not ever thought about interviewing before. So if you're a comedy podcast, have an author on. If you're a musician podcast, interview an athlete. Like that's how the podcast game gets bigger and better, is by interviewing people like yourself and
Right.
figuring out that there's some common ground and building off that and talking about a whole bunch of different things. And that's why we really invented Podstarz. So we're very happy to have a man who's as distinguished as yourself on our site. So thank you
Thank
for
you.
joining us, and feel
And
free
I
to
can
book
talk about
Mr.
lots
Tomms.
of things besides books.
Oh yeah, no, and that's the thing. Like a lot of our celebrities, like one of our he was on Star Trek for 15 years, and you would know, but he's a very acclaimed, highly acclaimed musician, and he's in his own band in Los Angeles, and he's
Mhm.
very into the politics scene, and he's like, I'm sick of talking about Star Trek. I know that's what I'm known for, but I'm music, politics, this and that. So there's so much to everybody out there. So that's what we're trying to tell the podcast community, is just because you may be listed as an author, you do have more to you other than an author. So
Right.
thank you very much, sir. Appreciate having you on the show.
Thank you.
And
Enjoyed it.
if you'd like to tell anyone who's listening where they can find you on social media, where they can purchase your books.
The links to my social media are on the website, and that's karlyletomms.com, KarlyleTomms. And I have Instagram. Mainly, I do Instagram and TikTok these days.
Oh,
Uh,
okay.
I will do Facebook. I'm on LinkedIn. I have two pages on LinkedIn, and I'm also on Twitter, formerly Twitter. It's like Prince, the
Formerly artist known
social
as.
media formerly known as Twitter.
Yeah, yeah. All right, sir. Thank you very much. Have a fantastic weekend. And once again, thank you for being on Podstarz. Thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you.
And until the next time, folks, this is Jay signing off from the Podstarz Team Podcast. And I will talk to you very shortly. Bye for now.